If you're just joining us, this is Destination Film, a series where I go to a strange city with a bunch of gear and make a movie. I've previously done Montreal and New York City, and this month I'm in Boston. The fact that this is the third city I'm visiting has given me a little time to reflect. What makes this city special? Like the other cities we've looked at so far, Boston is central to the East Coast film industry. But unlike Montreal, which is a chameleon and often sits in for other cities, or New York, which is a global crossroads, Boston is different. Films shot in Boston are usually set in Boston, and there are hundreds of films and TV shows that have done this, despite being a city of just 600,000 people, compared to the greater New York area, which is over 20 million. I've come to see why storytellers and films as diverse as The Departed, Black Mass, Boondock Saints, Shutter Island, Good Will Hunting, The Town, The Fighter, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Ted, and Mystic River all chose Boston as their setting. If LA embodies the American dream and New York embodies American power, Boston embodies the American struggle. This may be because Boston has two very different groups living side by side. The patrician elites, with their Harvard-educated accents, rub right up against the Irish and Italian immigrant, bar-hopping tough guys from Southie. This isn't to say other American cities don't have poor people. That is clearly not true. But none of those poor have been idealized and turned into a cliche, like the generational immigrant poor of Boston, just like there are thousands of other colleges in the US. But Harvard, with its elite mystique, stands alone. The tension between old money privilege and immigrant poverty has given Boston some of its most powerful stories, and it's a vein that filmmakers continue to mine. It doesn't hurt that the Irish mob, which now exists more in Hollywood's imagination than it does in real life, is a way for non-Italian actors like Jack Nicholson, Ben Affleck, Matt Damon, or Johnny Depp to play crime bosses and not seem overtly ridiculous in the way that Michael Shannon does in Bullet Train as the head of the Yakuza. It's also a city that's still haunted by its past and connected to the old world. For a long time, it has been the most Catholic-dominated city in the US, and the one with the strongest ties to Irish independence. I want to do this episode a little differently. I'm going to recreate some of the famous scenes from famous Boston movies in the location where they were shot, so I can look at the challenges that the filmmakers themselves faced and how they overcame them. I'm going to do the bar scene from The Departed, the meeting on the docks from Black Mass, and the famous park bench scene from Good Will Hunting. I've filled up my Subaru with lights, cameras, and the gear that I think I'm going to need, so off we go. So the first thing I love to do in a new city is walk around, get a feeling for the streets, get a feeling for the layout of the city, how people react to you, and what the pervading attitude is. I visit the dry cleaners that served as the hideout for Costello in The Departed. They rebadged it as a restaurant, but now it's just a dry cleaners. I visited the park bench from Good Will Hunting, and strangely enough, it's not marked in any way. I tried to get permission to shoot here, but because it's a very visible, famous location, I wasn't even able to get in contact with anyone. So I'm going to have to recreate it somewhere else. But we do have pretty good BTS for how they shot the scene, so I'm confident I'll be able to get something pretty close. So bar scenes can be a little tricky. The reason being that usually the two characters that you're shooting are looking at one another. But in a bar scene, they're both looking forward, like this example in The Departed. That means that the easiest way to light them is from above and then get some bounce off this table. So you see in this model, I have a single tube that is lighting their faces from 45 degrees above. I have this light blocker here, keeping that from spilling on the back wall. And then I have another tube behind them to give them hair light. If I look at how this renders, and it works great if they both keep looking forward. If he starts turning to the other person, then they turn at one another, you sort of get this front lit short side lighting, which isn't great. It doesn't mean it doesn't work. Here you see they did exactly this in Spotlight, and it looks fine. But it's just the strange constraints of a bar. If you go ahead and do what's called French coverage, which means shoot over the people's shoulders, you get something like this, and the reverse is here, but they actually need to turn quite a long way to one another. And you see even in my model here, they're like knees and hands are going into intersecting one another. So it's not ideal. Sometimes you start in this sort of setup where the two people are looking forward, and then as the conversation progresses, you can then move to an over-the-shoulder shot like this. So this is how I prepped the scene. Let's see what happened when I got to location. So I was staying in the Liberty Hotel in downtown Boston, which used to be a prison. And the bar in the ground floor is called the Alibi and has a criminal theme with mugshots on the walls. It is a really nicely lit bar with these Edison bulbs all the way along the main bar. But to get enough distance backwards, I decided to shoot on the end of the bar so I could get the camera back and have a longer lens, I think a 50mm, on the full-frame R5C. I used just a standard C-stand with a 4-foot nanolite power tube in a egg crate and boomed it over as our top light, set to 3500 Kelvin to match the tungsten. This was great. The background was a bit dark, so I put another power tube back there. When I went in for the single coverage, added a third tube on the bar itself to give it uplight because the bar was dark rather than bright, so there wasn't that much reflection up back on the subject as fill. On the singles, I was able to angle this one towards the door and get all that great daylight coming in, that because of the 3500 Kelvin of the interior, the daylight outside turns this deep blue and I get this great teal orange look in camera. Just like the previs, I tried the French overs, and the advantage of this was you see all the way down the bar and you get all that production value of the overhanging lights. If this had been a real scene, I definitely would have shot both of these, started off in the front coverage and gone to the French overs as the conversation developed, because it's always great to break up a scene like that to give a little bit of variety, especially in longer scenes. This whole scene I shot in exactly an hour. We had from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock to shoot it. That little device on top of the R5C is the Axoon CMO, which allows you to use your phone, iPhone or Android, as a high quality monitor and even secondary recorder. They're only $179 and it's a huge improvement over the internal monitor, and you don't need to bring a dedicated second monitor. So after wrapping the bar scene, we packed everything back into my Subaru and drove across town to a location that I had found that I'm pretty sure was where they shot this scene at the docks from Black Mass. Driving around Boston is a little bit like driving around New York City, with the exception that it's much harder to follow the directions. There are a lot of tunnels and bridges. Neither Google nor Apple Maps work particularly well because the GPS gets compromised by being underground. We got to the location. We didn't have permission to shoot on the actual property, but we were able to shoot on the street in front of it and get exactly the same view. Instead of the 8x8 or 12x12 they were using in the Black Mass clip, because again, I was working alone and I didn't have the ability to set up such a huge lighting setup, I decided to push a Nanlite Forza 150B into a 6-foot umbrella mounted to a C-stand, and I was really happy with the result. But because we were shooting digital and they were shooting on celluloid, I was able to get all this detail in the background of the city with a 1600 ISO. After we finished one side of shooting, the wind picked up, which is a common problem in Boston apparently, and I couldn't use the umbrella anymore because it was about to blow over. Luckily, there was a big white sign attached to the fence, and I just aimed the Forza into the sign and used it as my bounce for my main key, with the second Forza 60B as the rim light, like they used in Black Mass. The angle was a little off. I would have liked it to be higher. I got all this light under the chin, which wasn't ideal. But as far as last minute problem solving in response to an unknown challenge, I'm really happy with the result. More than other cities I've visited, Boston has far less of an indie film scene. Maybe because it's only a 3-hour train trip away from New York, which has a thriving indie scene. And I think that attracts a lot of the actors and crew that would normally stay in Boston. It was much harder to find talent here, much harder than anywhere else. And the permit process is a lot murkier. I emailed a bunch of different agencies and didn't really hear back from anybody. I think they want you to hire a union location manager who then applies for the permits on your behalf. Boston seems to be much more of a union town than other places I've shot. They definitely want you to come here and film, but they want you to do it on their own terms and hire local people as much as possible. Speaking of locals, I was able to connect with a Boston-based grip and cinematographer, and she was nice enough to sit down and tell me about shooting in Boston.
I feel like Boston's really unique obviously in a lot of ways because of all the different looks you can kind of get from the city itself. Like, Boston definitely has a reputation of being like the working class that gets stuff done and does it really well. Weather is significantly overlooked, I feel like, sometimes with crew that comes up from LA who think that they can shoot, you know, in East Boston during like crazy winds. And they're expecting, you know, DP comes in and expects to fly these big racks. And you're like, you're not gonna, we can't do that. And no is like, you know, not in their vocabulary. And they think that we're just being hard asses when really it's just about safety. And in the end, it's about getting everybody through this in one piece.
I ended up doing the Good Will Hunting video, and it actually turned out great. But there are a lot of small little insights in that I want to go into in depth. So I'm going to make it a separate video so as not to make this one over 20 minutes. Once it's up, I'll link to it here and in the description. But for the final part of this video, I wanted to go over everything that I learned traveling to New York, Boston, and Montreal. And in the past 3 months, what I've discovered about destination filmmaking. My main takeaway is that everyone has a plan until you get hit. You can script, you can previs, you can email everyone, get everything planned, but until you get on set, get to location, and actually see it with your own eyes, and actually put down the camera, start lighting it, you won't know what challenges you're gonna run into. If you wanna succeed and thrive at this type of filmmaking, I think you need two things. The first is a ton of experience solving the small and big problems that come up on set when you're doing this type of filmmaking. So every time you encounter something, you already have encountered it, solved that problem, and have the solution ready to go. That means if you're doing something mission critical that you can only do once, that you've invested a lot of time and money in, you don't want to leave it to chance. You want to have practiced that thing before. You want to have shot a scene similar to it in a similar location if possible. You want to have previs that shot, know exactly what you're going to do. Don't make it up when you get there, and hope for the best. The second thing is to work with the same gear consistently from shoot to shoot. If you jump from camera system to camera system or lighting brand to lighting brand, everything works a little bit differently, and you are often going to get yourself stuck in places and having to discover problems that you didn't know were going to happen on set, or even worse, when you get back from set in the editing room and something looks nothing like you wanted it to look. You want to work consistently with the same gear and upgrade within that brand so that you know what to expect and you don't have to start from scratch. I need to be really clear and say that on none of these trips could I have actually gone and made a full film. It was very fly by night, show up and shoot something sort of filmmaking, which I actually really enjoy. But if I wanted to go back to any of these destinations and do a more complete project, I'm so much better equipped now because I've been there, taken the measure of the place, and I know what kind of challenges I need to prepare for. Another reason to do this sort of filmmaking is to find out for yourself what kind of filmmaking you enjoy, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and how you want to challenge yourself. Filmmaking should never be a walk in the park. If it's too easy, you're not being ambitious enough, and you could accomplish much more with the time that you have. But different people like different types of challenges. I personally love this sort of small crew solving problems on the fly. Back when I directed commercials and had big crews and big budgets, I hated it because even when I was the director, I had very little control. I was always waiting on someone else to do something else, and the final product was never really up to me. I much prefer setting my own agenda and spending my own money to get the result that I personally find interesting. When I originally conceived of this series, I wanted to go to really exotic places like Havana or Tokyo or Mongolia, but I knew enough about my own skill set that to just show up in those places with a camera and try and shoot would really have been too much of a challenge. And I wanted to start slowly with places that I was already sort of familiar with and see what kind of problems I encountered, solve those, and then have a more complete framework for going further abroad. I think anyone can improve as a filmmaker if they intelligently set themselves challenges like this, constantly staying just at the end of their sphere of competence, so that they're always improving, but not challenging themselves so much that it blows up in their face and everything falls apart and potentially someone gets hurt. Thank you very much for coming on this journey with me. And thank you again to our sponsors of Saramonic, Axsoon, Tenba, and Nanlite. Their gear was a huge asset to the shoot, and this wouldn't have been possible without them. I'll list everything in the description below. Thank you very much for watching Destination Film. I will see you next time.